So after Kron Gracie's victory over Bruce Leroy, also known as Alex Caceres, Ben Askren decided to put up a tweet that got a lot of people upset on Twitter. And what he said was not trying to start a fight, but wrestlers hold 7 of 8 male UFC titles, and people are meh. One high-level BJJ guy chokes a very low-level grappler, and people are like, BJJ for life. And Coach Kavanaugh, Conor McGregor's coach, or at least former coach, not sure what's going on with Conor right now. That's a separate issue. Just put up a gif of saying BJJ for life. It's still real to me, damn it. So this is a conversation that we've had over and over and over again. And what annoys me about it is that it's a conversation where, depending on how you word the question of what's more effective, BJJ or wrestling, you can get different answers, but people tend to conflate the answers in them. So just to kind of go back and get to the beginning of how this thing all started, back when the UFC started out, that was the question they were asking was, let's take a bunch of one-dimensional fighters, put them up against each other, and see who wins. And time after time, it was jiu-jitsu that won. When it was a guy who just knew jiu-jitsu going against a guy who just wrestled, or a guy who just did karate, a guy who just did kempo, a guy who just did taekwondo. And from there, that really spawned a lot of popularity for Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu at the time was not very big in America. Now it seems like pretty much everywhere you go, there's a school somewhere nearby within at least like a 30-minute to an hour radius. Well, I guess in some rural areas that's not the case. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that jiu-jitsu was shown to be so effective as a single style. Now, as the game evolved, it went from having just guys who were doing one thing to guys who realized, hey, I do need to pick up jiu-jitsu and add it to my game. Hey, I do need to pick up boxing and add it to my game. And as the game's evolved, instead of seeing jiu-jitsu guys continue to dominate, we've started to see more wrestlers dominate. And so the question then becomes, why is it that wrestlers are dominating now after they start picking up other aspects? Is it because wrestling is a better base technically? Is it because if you look at the structure of wrestling right now, a lot of times when you're wrestling as a kid, you're just going there to practice. Then you're in high school, you're in college, and it's just constant practice, constant grinding. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, a lot of these jiu-jitsu gyms, they're businesses. So if you're paying $100+ a month to go there, they're not going to want to drive people away by going way too hard on them. So maybe there's a difference in training. Is it a technique thing? But I feel like Ben Askren's one of those people where he tends to conflate it, where, again, I feel like at this point you can't argue that if you're going if you're saying we're going to have a fight between a guy who only does jiu-jitsu and a guy who only does wrestling, that the jiu-jitsu guy's going to win. I think at this point you kind of have to say that's the case, because that's exactly what the early UFCs tested, and jiu-jitsu came out on top in that experiment. But now the current question of modern day, if you are looking to win a UFC title 10 years from now, would you rather have, say, all-American level wrestling or a black belt in jiu-jitsu? I think in that case, all-American level wrestling, probably the better argument. But if there is still any question, I think a reason why a lot of jiu-jitsu guys get behind the BJJ for life thing is that they see a jiu-jitsu guy who goes into a fight and does a lot of stuff that you'll see in a jiu-jitsu gym all the time, and they kind of relate to it. Whereas in wrestling, even if you're just taking a guy down and beating him up there, you're never really throwing punches in wrestling practice. So there is at least some improvisation there, if not techniques from other arts that you're seeing. So, for example, when a guy like Ben Askren takes a guy down and starts beating him up and even passes his guard, a lot of the stuff he's doing isn't stuff that he's going to do in a wrestling room. But when Kron Gracie takes a guy's back, slips in a choke, and puts him out, a lot of people can see themselves doing something like that, and it's kind of inspirational in that way. So I think that's a big reason why a lot of times when these high-level jiu-jitsu guys get on the scene and they actually have some success, like a Damian Maia, they become so popular within the jiu-jitsu community. But like this video showing here, this is an example of Marcelo Garcia, an 80cc champion, world champion jiu-jitsu guy, going up against Olympian Ben Askren in just a submission grappling round, and Marcelo Garcia just tears him to shreds here. Like, he already got one guillotine. Right now looks like he's about to catch another guillotine. And this is all, the second one within 90 seconds. So just from the standpoint of jiu-jitsu only versus wrestling only, the argument has to be that jiu-jitsu is superior. It's just once you start looking at adding the other martial arts, what's the best base? And I'd argue that from a technical standpoint, wrestling, a big reason why wrestling's had the success it's had is just because of how hard people have to work within the sport. But a lot of the special traits that are involved in wrestling aren't technical traits. They're more traits that are kind of cultural to the sport. And that does matter, but in theory, you could take that culture into a jiu-jitsu gym, and there are some jiu-jitsu gyms who have a similar culture to a lot of wrestling teams, but nowhere near as many as there are as wrestling teams who have that type of culture. But to get back to his point, he was specifically talking about within the rankings. So I decided to look in the rankings, and we have both the pound for pound and then like the rankings per division. So let's just look at what he's saying. He was saying 7 of 8. Now the question of Robert Whitaker was one that I'll get to soon. But if you look at the flyweight, for example, flyweight rankings, I'll just go top 3 just to kind of expand it out and put a little bit more space in there. So for flyweight, Henry Cejudo, freestyle wrestling gold medalist. I have no idea what belt he has in jiu-jitsu, if he even has a belt, or if he just trains no-gi. So in that case, definitely a wrestler. Jusei Formiga, he's a jiu-jitsu guy. And then Benavidez is more of a wrestler. At bantamweight, TJ Dillashaw, wrestling background. I believe he's a blue belt in jiu-jitsu right now, but doesn't really train in the gi very often. Marlon Moraes, black belt in jiu-jitsu, who just fought in a title eliminator against Rafael Sensei, also a black belt. And then Cody Garbrandt is in there as well, having a mix of both wrestling and boxing. Boxing's been his primary tool for success, but in high school he was one of the better guys in the state of Ohio and probably would have been wrestling at a D1 level had he stayed in school and kept on the straight and narrow at that point. At featherweight, champion Max Holloway, mostly a striker. I don't know if he's done any wrestling or what his wrestling background is. I believe he's a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu right now, but doesn't really have a great wrestling background. Jose Aldo, actually a Jiu-Jitsu background, though he's more well known for his striking. And then Ortega, again, Jiu-Jitsu background. At 155, Khabib, actually more of a Sambo background. People like to peg him as a wrestler. He does wrestle too, but I think I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure his background is technically combat Sambo. Sambo does have takedowns involved in it, so there is wrestling involved in Sambo, but technically there's wrestling involved in Jiu-Jitsu too. There's a lot of overlapping in a lot of the grappling arts, like Judo and Jiu-Jitsu have a lot of similarities. But I think if you're being technically correct with Khabib, it'd be Sambo, but if you want to call him a wrestler, that's fine. A lot of what he does overlaps with wrestling. Tony Ferguson, wrestler. Connor, boxer. At welterweight, Tyron Woodley, wrestler. Colby, wrestler. Kamaru, wrestler. So that fits in line perfectly with what Ben Askren was saying there in his own division. At middleweight with Whitaker, I'm fairly sure with Whitaker he actually started off in jiu-jitsu. That was his first art. It's not like he had like a giant base in any one art and then just started branching out from there. He seems like one of the kind of guys who was training all of it pretty much right off the bat. But he's a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu right now. He was on the team for Australia for the Commonwealth Games for wrestling, but had to pull out for injury. But I don't know that that's because he had a wrestling background first, and then I don't know if he's been wrestling since he was a kid. I just think he adapted to wrestling really well and kind of integrated it in his training. And Australia isn't exactly known for having great wrestlers, so he was able to work his way to the top there that way, as opposed to just being a lifetime wrestler. After that, you have Yoel Romero, a freestyle wrestler, and Luke Rockhold, a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, has good wrestling too, but Jiu-Jitsu was his base. John Jones, wrestler. Daniel Cormier, wrestler. Gustafsson, boxer. And then at heavyweight, you have Daniel Cormier, wrestler. Stipe Miocic, wrestler, and Francis, I guess, striker, although not the most technical guy. He definitely gets away with his size for sure. And then in the pound for pound list, Cormier, wrestler. Jones, wrestler. Khabib, combat sambo / wrestling. Holloway, striking. Cejudo, wrestling. Woodley, wrestling. Nunes, black belt in judo, black belt in jiu-jitsu, decent boxing. Wouldn't call her a wrestler. I don't know whether you want to throw the judo label on her or the jiu-jitsu label on her. Either would work. GSP actually had a karate background to start, although he was more known for his wrestling and top control, or at least top Brazilian jiu-jitsu control. A really good guard passing. Was one of the first guys to be able to pass BJ Benn's card. TJ Dillashaw, wrestler. Connor, boxer. Stipe, wrestler. Whitaker, mixed, I'll just say. Ferguson, wrestler. Rose is probably, I think Rose started off just training MMA straight up. She's known for her boxing and her grappling. Not exactly known as a great takedown artist, but she's got a little bit of everything. And then Chris Cyborg. Again, that's kind of a tough one to say. She's a purple belt world champion in jiu-jitsu. I believe now a brown belt. Her boxing is probably what she's known best for. So not a wrestler, but kind of a mix of everything too. So point being, it definitely is showing to be successful right now to have a wrestling base and being able to build off of it. But it's understandable why jiu-jitsu fans get excited every time a jiu-jitsu guy does well, just because straight up jiu-jitsu can be duplicated in the octagon a little bit easier than straight up wrestling, because there aren't really any finishes in folk style wrestling that would be a finish in MMA, so to speak.